Welcome on in, golf fans. It's your boy Gsluke here with our course breakdown for this week's Charles Schwab Challenge. Gonna go through all things Colonial Country Club, get you guys ready for all of your exposure this week with a look at the course details, what to expect around this kind of track, some of the analytics per bet the number golf, as well as a hole-by-hole breakdown, my custom modeling and key stats for this week, as well as a few comp courses around the PGA Tour that should play similar to what we get with conditions that you can use for some leaderboard crossover. So by the end, you'll be an expert on all things to expect, and with a lot to go through, it's not waste any time at all, and start it off with first off some of those course details and the analytics per bet the number. This golf course underwent a complete renovation before they played this last year, so we had a lot of unknowns heading into that event, but now that we've seen it for a whole 72 holes, we have a pretty good idea of what to expect around there. The greens were firm, maybe going to be a little softer after a year of getting broken in, but still going to be a little bit firmer than what we're used to around here. There were a lot of missed greens last year. The wind really wreaked havoc when it kicked up at times, and that's what you expect from a Texas golf course. So in terms of the specifics, it is a par 70 setup, so not a whole bunch of par 5s for these players to attack, and it added a little bit of yardage after the renovation, but at just under 7,300 yards, 7,289 to be exact, it is far from a long golf course. The agronomy is bent grass and always has been bent grass around this venue. The people that created Colonial Country Club had that as one of their main designs for even creating the golf course to begin with, so not a surprise that they kept that after the renovation. Just a different strain of bent grass, that James Bond XL, as they talk it with the 007. You also have Bermuda grass elsewhere, so Bermuda grass rough, fairways, all of that, and it's 2.5 inches, which doesn't seem that lengthy for a rough, but because it is a sticky Bermuda grass, it's going to play a little bit more penal than that normal 2.5-inch rough. The greens are small, and with them being extra bouncy, led to an extremely low green and regulation rate. We'll see that when we get to some of the stats here in a second, but there's a lot of a lot of bunkers out there, a lot of fairways that run off into the rough as well, so the fairway rate was also a little bit lower than what we're used to seeing, and there's not a whole bunch of water in play, as you usually don't see a whole bunch in the state of Texas, but a really good overall test. You have some short hitters that find success around here because it's not an overly demanding test when it comes to the length, but because you have the really firm greens in play, having a high ball flight, having power and shorter clubs into the greens was also a really big part of last year's event. So a Davis Riley, of course, was more of that second type of skill set, but if you look at that top 5, top 10, as we will here in a second, there were a lot of shorter guys that played well as well, like a Morikawa, Sepp aren't overly imposing off the tee. Your Hayden Buckleys of the world also don't bomb in off the tee, whereas you had your Scotties, your Keegans, who's a pretty good off the tee player, then of course Davis Riley taking it home. I think it's a very fair test for all of these players. In terms of our averages, we're going to narrow them down to just last year, as that is after the renovation that they did, and you'll see the fairway rate a little bit lower than your PGA Tour average, so a little bit over 7.8 being hit per round. Your green regulation rate was nearly 10% lower though than what we have for a PGA Tour average course. So very firm greens. They might be a little softer after another year, but I would still expect them to be very difficult to hit, especially when the wind kicks up. Your scrambling rate was a little bit better than your PGA Tour average. Reason for that is the rough around the green isn't overly imposing. It's not major championship type rough, and the greens also aren't the most difficult that we have on the tour. So not a surprise that the 3-putt percentage is also about 3% lower than what we normally have, but because it's so hard to get close to the pin locations when they're going to be as firm and fast as what you have these first few years after the renovation, birdie rate was only about 2.78 per round last year, and the bogey rate was higher than your PGA Tour average, because even when players hit solid shots, they were hitting greens and bouncing into that rough. So scrambling rate, people being able to get up and down, was also a key that you had towards the top, and that's why you had some of your best players in the world like a Scotty, a Colin, a Sepp Straka feeding towards the top end of that leaderboard, as they're the most well-rounded players. Ball striking is always going to be key at these events, but the short game can't be overlooked. So like I said, a very well-rounded test, and I think extremely fair for these players. With some of the advanced analytics, you'll see that there's 9 driver holes around a Colonial Country Club. They do have it as a slight bomber's paradise, mostly because you can hit those high apex height shots, but there's not a big penalty for being short off the tee. So that's something that I've noticed about this golf course, is even if you are one of the shortest guys on all the PGA Tour, you're not going to be at a massive disadvantage around Colonial. The approach distribution skews extremely heavily from 125 to 175. In fact, over 8 shots per round coming in that proximity bucket. So when we get to our iron emphasis, we're going to be adding quite a bit of extra in that range. And the around the green distribution is pretty flat, I would say. It doesn't really skew towards one specific type of grass. No fringe at this golf course. They took that out after the renovation, and very balanced with these other three categories. And maybe more shots coming from the rough than the other two categories, which would be the bunkers and the fairway. But you have to be able to do it out of all three surfaces. We're not going to be focusing on just fairway around the green, not just bunker around the green. You're going to have every single aspect there. And then your make percentages are a little bit higher the shorter you are to the hole around this golf course, which is because you don't have a ton of undulation. Unlike what you had at Quail Hollow and Augusta National, for example, where your 3-4 footers are going to move sometimes a cup or two. In this golf course, you're within the cup on almost every read in that range. So you're going to see a lot of putts made by the field there, and it should give you a general sense of what to expect around Colonial. But to give you guys an even better idea of exactly what these players are going to be facing, let's go hole by hole and show you exactly every shot required around this venue. These overhead views are adjusted for the renovation, which is pretty sweet for our purposes. So hole number 1 here, par 5, 593 yards, so not easy to reach into if you're a shorter player. This is a hole where being a bomber will be advantageous, but there's also going to be plenty of holes where it doesn't matter at all how far you hit it. So if you're going to be a bomber, you better take advantage of hole 1, because it's one of the few times the entire round where you're really going to get that kind of a leg up. Hole 2 is 386. You're going to see a lot of people laying up off the tee here. There are some trees that come into play if you choose to take a driver, and the angle, if you miss in the right side rough, can be really tough depending on pin. Now, if it's a back left pin where you have all this room to work with, it wouldn't surprise me for the longer players to take driver here, but unless you're Jason Kokrak, who dismantled this place, most people are going to be hitting a driving iron or 3-wood there. Hole 3 is 477, so it is one of the longer par 4s that you have, but the longer you are, the more you can cut off this corner. So this is one of the few examples where being a bomber matters, and the trees to the right are going to have a lot more leaves on them, so they're going to be more penal than it looks like from this overhead view. But even if you hit a 3-wood, a driver to this corner here, it's going to be a tough hole, and even if you execute the shot over the corner, it's not going to be a gimme par, as this is one of the harder holes that you have out there. Hole 4 is 247, so a long par 3. A lot of times they will move up the tee box here, particularly for rounds 1 and 2, but a very small green complex, especially from 250 yards. So another one of those trickier holes that you have around Colonial. Hole 5 is 471, so this 3-hole stretch between the last par 3, the long par 4 before that, and then this par 4 that is 471 yards, especially with how tree-lined and how claustrophobic this tee shot can be, makes it one of the harder stretches on this golf course, if not the hardest, I would say. Hole 6 is 410, dogleg from left to right. A lot of people are going to hit less than driver, just because if you hit driver, it brings in the trees to the left and the right, and that fairway bunker out there throughout the fairway. So a lot of people just being more positional at 6. Hole 7 is 478, a medium to longer par 4, and the front 9 here can be pretty brutal at times. The back 9 has some shorter holes that are better for those players, but keep in mind that because it's in Texas, and most times there's a lot of rollout in the fairways here, even some of your shorter players are routinely hitting drives 310 to 320, so the length isn't as much of a factor as you might expect. Hole 8 is 195, so this is a pretty straightforward par 3. Back left pin locations, though, can be exponentially more difficult than what you have in this front right corner. Hole 9 is 410, so it's a pretty claustrophobic tee shot, but you're not really hitting driver here. There's just no incentive, because even if you lay back with an iron, you're going to have a wedge into this green. Hole 10, so if you're starting on the back, this is the easier of the two sides. So first off, you have a pitch and putt par 4, so something less than driver because of that natural area coming into play, and still a wedge, a 9-iron at the very most in. Hole 11 is 640, so it is a long par 5. Once again, your shorter players are going to struggle to reach this in 2, but if it's into the wind or even a neutral wind direction, even your bombers are going to have a hard time getting home. So, your longest players in the field, wouldn't surprise me if they got on or around the green complex, but a lot of guys hitting it to a wedge spot and then trying to be very precise from 100 yards and in. Hole 12 is 455, so this is a shorter par 4, believe it or not, because of all the rollout you get at this course. Most players are going to have 135, 140 yards at most, putting them right in between these bunkers, so you do have to be pretty precise. If you're a longer player, you can take them out of play by carrying it 300. 13 is 196, so you do have water in play technically on this hole, but it's far enough away where not many players are going to end up in there unless it's a complete miss hit, which will happen at times. 14 is 458, so another shorter par 4. This one, you don't have that many trees on the corner, so you can kind of just bomb driver out there, and even if you miss left, you should have an angle into the green. If you're a bomber, I don't necessarily think it helps you on this hole, though, because all these guys can carry at 300. Like, even your shortest players are going to be able to get it around that sort of an obstacle. 15 is 431, so another shorter par 4, and you can see why this side's easier. You don't have to hit nearly as many drivers, and those medium to longer par 4s just aren't a thing. 16 is 196, another hole with technically water in play, but you can see you'd have to completely shank it to end up over there. 17 is 400, another scoreable look. A claustrophobic tee shot, though, and this is an extremely hard fairway to hit, at least compared to what it looks like from the overhead view. A lot of camber in the fairway, and setting up an angle into this green depending on pin can be key. Back left, you want to be on the right side of the fairway. Back right pin, you ideally want to be coming in from as far left as possible. That's really the key on a hole like 17. And then finally, 18 is 441, slight dogleg from right to left. Water is in play for the second shot here, but really only for left side pin locations. The last few years, they've had rough down here that has cotton balls before it's gone into the lake, and I'm kind of hoping that they shave it down at some point, just especially when they use this back left pin to add that variance. But as is, it's an extremely difficult green. I think that's the hardest part about 18. The ball striking test is not really asking that much because you can hit driver 8 or 9 iron into it, which these players are going to put to 15 to 30 feet in most cases. The green, though, itself is where you can see that carnage. So hole 18, especially on Sunday, I'm going to have my eye on that sort of hole, but a perfect kind of finish around this renovated golf course. And now that we've gone hole by hole, let's give you guys an idea of the kind of key stats I'm looking for out there in my player pool this week. So you've got the normal shots gained metrics on here, which we're not going to focus on all that much. Your regular shots gained off the tee, approach, around the green, in your putting. I will note, though, that these putting stats to the right are going to be looking at bent grass putting stats, which is the surface that we have for the week. But around the green, just looking at form heading in here. So, if you're somebody that is doing really well around the green, that is going to be useful at a course where you're missing all these kind of greens. But your ball striking stats also going to be in our model. So you're not going to spend that much time because these are the kind of key stats that you should be looking at every single week. But some of your best off the tee players lately would be a Scotty, Enrico, Keith Mitchell, and Jesper. A lot of your bombers that on a week like this are going to have some advantageous spots, but it's not like it's a course where only bombers are going to find some success. Your approach play is probably the most important recent form thing to look at. So if you're looking at any one of these key stat categories the most, approach play is usually the go-to. You can look at Scotty Scheffler's iron play as the best in the field, Norlander gaining over a stroke per round, but your Aaron Rise, your Bergers, your Valamakis, even the whole way down here to your Damons, your Blairs that are gaining over a half a stroke per round are all going to get a significant bump in my modeling, and that's going to be the case for every single golf tournament that we play. It's the most consistent category that we have for these players on tour because your golf swing is something that you can continue from day to day, event to event, even from month to month on tour. And when you see players finding their swing for a season or two, oftentimes it's their best few seasons of their career. So looking for these players that are excelling off the tee as well, that's another category that's a little bit more consistent from event to event out here. That's why those two categories get the most emphasis for me. On top of that, we're looking at approach from 125 to 200. If you guys remember from the course details page before, a lot of extra shots, particularly from 125 to 175. So players that can gain strokes to the field with these sort of shots are going to also get a boost in my modeling. Your Carl Phillips, your Joseph Bramlett's, Neil Shipley, Zach Blair's, all players that are doing well compared to the field. You also have your Robbie Shones, Ben Cole, Scotty Scheffler, not a surprise to see excelling in almost every category that we're looking at on a week like this. But all of these guys towards the top that are dark green, even into the light green, are going to get an extra brownie point or two in the model. Around the green, you can look at that form, but it's still something that you can't go overboard with because ideally we don't want our players missing a whole bunch of greens to begin with. But at a golf course with bouncy greens like this and only 5,000 square foot greens, you're gonna miss some by default. So it is something I'm incorporating. And then the shots gained putting, to look at some of the best bent grass putters. Harris English, number one in the field. We're gonna talk about Harry in a second with the apex height. Harris English, especially with the second place finish at the PGA Championship, might be like the best modeling ranked play that I've seen for quite some time. In fact, I think he's going to be mega chalk this week. His outright number is like 30 30-1 on books. It's getting steamed down like crazy, and I kind of agree with it. I understand why everyone's betting it, because not only has he been solid ball striking lately, gaining in both of those categories, he's the best bentgrass putter that we have in this field, and because the greens are bouncy, you saw this with Davis Riley last year, the guys that can launch the ball super high into the air are at a distinct advantage. And if we sort this by apex height, look who's up there in the top 5, top 10. You have Riley, last year's champion, a lot of these other long players, and then Ricky Fowler, who he doesn't have the best stats otherwise, but if he's going to hit the ball super high with his irons and his off the tee, that is a massive advantage around here. Davis Riley, and then of course Harris English, they're around number like 10 or 15 when it comes to the apex height. So I know we're getting a little bit ahead of ourselves, but if you can find stuff like the bentgrass putting stats and apex height and some good iron form heading in, then that's why he's number 2 to only a Scotty Scheffler in a field like this. And Mackenzie Hughes is also a sneaky good bentgrass putter and a player that has a relatively high apex height. So I know he's missed a few cuts in a row at the PGA Championship and CJ Cup Byron Nelson, but at number 15 in the model, he's the kind of guy that I'll be looking to for maybe a value play in DFS or even a top 10, a top 20 bet. Pearson Cootie's been playing on a lot of weaker field events, so do take this with a grain of salt, but he's been really good on bentgrass putting and hits the ball relatively high. Harry Hall's a good bentgrass putter that putts well on the surface and hits the ball relatively high. You're trying to look for guys that check 3, 4, maybe even 5 boxes in what we're looking for here, and those are going to be some of the better modeling plays of the week. And scrambling, so on top of just regular around the green, you want to find guys that can get up and down when you're only hitting 10 to 11 greens per round. So kind of surprising here is a Chris Gotterup there at 71%. Danny Willett, Daniel Berger, very, very good around the green players. Scotty Scheffler as well. Andrew Novak, all guys I'd expect to see towards the top end of this list. But your Gotterups of the world, your Quade Cummins, your Bryce Garnetts, your Matt Wallaces, could be sneakier guys to consider. And Matt Wallace has always been a really good short game player, so it shouldn't be that mind-blowing to me, but he's also a guy with a high apex height that top 20'd at the PGA Championship. So just perhaps a few names to point out there. A Joseph Bramlett, a high apex player. A Michael Kim, a high apex player that is relatively good with the short game. So to look at the apex height just one more time again to try and find some poppers, you have Keith Mitchell, who's been really good ball striking form, also hits the ball a mile in the air. Ricky Castillo, same thing, gaining in the 2 ball striking categories. Decent around the green player too. And dude, I've heard a lot of good things about Castillo's around the green play. They said when he was in contention at, I guess it was the CJ Cup Byron Nelson, that they were saying he's got one of the best short games of anyone in the world. If that's the case, that's a really good course fit at a firm, fast golf course like this, especially because of how high he hits the ball. So another guy you might want to consider. Davis Riley, right? He checks a lot of the boxes that we're looking at as well. He, of course, had the runner-up finish at the PGA Championship, so I think that he could be a no-brainer play to consider in DFS as well. Harris English, Ben Griffin also surprisingly hits the ball pretty high. And by the way, this apex height is a driving stat, so we're mostly considering this apex height when we're considering the second shot into greens, but that isn't something that they do stat keeping on the PGA Tour. So it is just the best guess that we have. I'm sure there's going to be some exceptions to the rule where guys hit the ball high off the tee but then low with their irons, but in general your ball flight usually is pretty similar in both cases. Like I said, a few guys that are going to buck that trend, but that's why we're looking at this apex height stat. You have Eric Cole, he hits the ball relatively high and he's a good scrambler. These are all the kind of players that I'm going to be double checking and trying to find ways to get into my player pool. So outside of that, we also have some comp courses we can consider. So I'm looking at some shorter, more positional golf courses where you're missing a lot of greens. RBC Heritage would be exactly one of those kind of tracks. It is a signature field event, at least for the last few years, but if you're looking at your top level players, you could find some leaderboard crossover. I'm also looking at the RSM Classic, so that's both courses. They have the Seaside and the Plantation for the first few days, and then they played the Seaside for the last 2. This is a shorter, more positional course. We're going to be missing a lot of greens. Also the same kind of par 70 setup. So you can look at those leaderboards for some of those players that are popping as well. And then the last one would be TPC Southwind in the FedEx St. Jude Championship. Another par 70 that's about the same yardage as what we have this week. Different agronomy. That's the issue with all 3 of these, is that they have completely different agronomy as what we're going to be playing out here for this kind of event, but the same kind of approach profile at all 3 of these golf courses. And it has been a signature signature event as well, actually a playoff event for all of its existence. But for some of your top level players, your top end of the 7K range, 8, 9, and 10K range players, you can use that for some of your research purposes. So that's what I'm looking for in players, our key stats, our comp courses, and hopefully we can add on top of last week's outright that we hit on Scotty Scheffler. Alrighty guys, that is all I've got for this week's course preview. Go ahead, smash that like button if you guys haven't already, and also comment down below what you've got as this week's winning score for a chance to earn a free month on my Patreon page. On there is where I'm posting all my projections for these events, every single outright bet that I'm playing, my props on underdog and prize picks. So for a chance to earn all of the extra content for free, go ahead and just give me your winning score. It will be on a first come first serve basis, so the first person to guess that correct winning score will be the person that earns that free month access. Best of luck with that giveaway, with all of the exposure and bets that you're going with for this event, and it should be a fun one. I know sometimes there's a little bit of a hangover after these major championships, maybe not as many people watching the sport, but for hardcore fans like myself, it is still another opportunity to try and have ourselves a week, which we had at the PGA Championship. It was a relatively successful one for us in our exposure, mostly because of what Scotty Scheffler did in getting that dub. But this week, I'm going to try and make it back-to-back weeks with an outright win. So hopefully we can continue that going, have ourselves some fun for this sort of event. Best of luck with everything that you guys are going with, and I'll see you guys for all the content throughout the week.